The sun hung low over the sprawling magnolia trees, their pale blossoms trembling in the soft southern breeze, as if even the wind knew the secrets buried beneath the soil. The plantation lay in quiet dignity, white-pillared and vast, a relic of wealth and decay, where the air was heavy with the mingling scents of fresh earth, sweat, and something older, something unspoken, a tension woven into the lives of all who moved within its boundaries. On the veranda, where the shadows of the columns stretched long across the polished wooden floor, Nathaniel Whitmore leaned against a post, his hands buried in the pockets of his waistcoat. He was a man of imposing presence, tall and broad-shouldered, his face lined with a mixture of inherited refinement and the subtle marks of worry that came from years of managing land, labor, and the expectations of a society built on inequality. His eyes, a pale gray, rested on the fields with a careful detachment, but there was a storm behind them, a storm only he seemed aware of. Across the yard, moving with quiet purpose among the rows of cotton, was Liliana. She carried herself with an effortless grace that seemed almost unnatural, as if the burdens of her existence could not touch her entirely. Her skin, dark as the rich soil, glowed in the afternoon light, and her eyes, large, almond-shaped, and luminous, were pools of both intelligence and unspoken sorrow. She worked with the other women, yet there was a distinction in her movements, a subtle defiance that whispered of a mind too sharp to be dulled by chains or labor. Nathaniel's gaze followed her, as it often did, longer than propriety would allow. He told himself he admired her diligence, her resilience, her uncanny ability to anticipate the needs of the household without instruction. But beneath the admiration, there was something more complicated, more dangerous, a fascination that gnawed at the edges of his conscience. He knew the law, he knew society, and he knew his wife's watchful eyes, yet he could not stop the pull that Liliana exerted over him. Margaret Whitmore, his wife, sat inside the house, a faint rustle of lace and silk accompanying her movements as she read by the window. Her eyes, sharp and calculating beneath their soft veil of warmth, occasionally flicked toward the veranda, noticing the intensity of Nathaniel's stare. Margaret had been raised to recognize power and wealth, and she had married Nathaniel not for love, but for security, prestige, and the quiet assurance of control that came with being the mistress of Whitmore Estate. Her heart, if it still held one, had grown accustomed to routine. Her life had been sculpted into lines of obligation and appearances. Yet, she too sensed something shifting, a subtle imbalance in the currents of desire and attention that threaded through her household. Nathaniel exhaled, his breath slow, almost reluctant. Liliana bent down to tie the hem of her skirt, and for a fleeting moment, their eyes met. The connection was electric, unspoken, a collision of awareness and longing. She looked away almost immediately, as if fearing that lingering would betray them both. But Nathaniel did not look away. He allowed the moment to stretch, a dangerous indulgence, before turning back to the fields, hiding his inner tumult behind a mask of cold detachment. The work of the day continued, but every gesture, every glance, was punctuated by a tension that seemed to hum in the air. Nathaniel found himself imagining scenarios that had no place in his life, daydreams where the constraints of law, of morality, of custom, dissolved like smoke. In these fantasies, he and Liliana existed in a world apart, where desire could be confessed without fear, where touch was neither scandal nor sin, but simply an acknowledgement of what the heart recognized, even when the mind resisted. Yet reality intruded with cruel persistence. Nathaniel's responsibilities were immense: the fields, the accounts, the maintenance of appearances for the neighbors who would have gossiped and condemned without hesitation. His marriage was a gilded cage, safe, predictable, but hollow. Margaret, in her delicate perfection, was unaware of the depth of her husband's fascination, seeing only what she wanted to see: a dutiful husband, a manager of the estate, a man capable of control. The truth of Nathaniel's heart, the dangerous tilt of his desire, remained a secret shared only with the shadows that stretched across the veranda each evening. Even Liliana felt it. She had known for years that Nathaniel's glances lingered too long, that there were unspoken words in the air between them. But to acknowledge them was perilous. The world she inhabited offered her no protection, no refuge beyond the carefully measured steps she took to avoid reprisal. Yet, in those rare moments when their eyes met and the rest of the world fell away, she felt a surge of something forbidden, something intoxicating. It was both thrilling and terrifying, a whisper of escape, of recognition, of a connection that could never truly exist in the light of day. The evening drew near, and with it, the plantation settled into a quiet rhythm. Horses were led back to their stables, the dogs barked their last warning, and the workers, weary and aching, made their way to the small cabins that served as their homes. Nathaniel stood once more on the veranda, his silhouette framed against the sinking sun. Liliana approached, carrying a basket of freshly picked cotton, her movements precise, efficient, yet infused with a subtle elegance that refused to be hidden. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice soft, almost musical. "Evening, Liliana," Nathaniel replied, his tone steady, though his pulse betrayed him. "You've done well today." She nodded, a small, polite smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you, sir. I aim to please." The simplicity of the exchange belied the storm beneath it. Every word, every breath, carried weight. Nathaniel knew that even the smallest touch, the briefest glance, could ignite a fire that neither of them could contain. And yet, they were bound by roles imposed at birth, by laws that treated humans as property, by the unforgiving gaze of society. As she turned to leave, Nathaniel felt an inexplicable pang, a mixture of desire, guilt, and an aching longing. He wanted to call her back, to speak words that would dissolve the space between them, to reach across the invisible line that divided master and slave, but he did not. He let her retreat, carrying the quiet dignity of her strength, leaving him to wrestle alone with the dangerous truth of his own heart. Inside the house, Margaret observed the shifting light, her eyes drifting toward the veranda one last time before retreating into the familiar comfort of her books and embroidery. She did not know, could not know, the depth of the conflict that raged just beyond the walls, nor the subtle, unspoken alliance forming between the master of the estate and the woman who was, by law, his property. The plantation, vast and silent now, seemed to hold its breath. The shadows lengthened, curling around columns, trees, and windows, as if nature itself recognized the tension between what was lawful and what was inevitable. Somewhere in the distance, a whip cracked, a reminder of the rules that governed this land, the punishments that could befall those who stepped too far from their prescribed place. Yet for Nathaniel, for Liliana, there existed moments when the rules seemed almost trivial, when desire threatened to outweigh duty, when the heart whispered truths the mind dared not speak. And so, under the magnolia trees, in the fading light of day, two souls existed on the edge of something dangerous, beautiful, and irrevocable. The air trembled with unspoken words, stolen glances, and the quiet knowledge that the life they led was built on layers of control, obligation, and suppression. Yet in that tension lay a fragile hope, fragile, perilous, and perhaps the only real thing either of them had ever known. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Shadows swallowed the veranda, and with it, the brief intimacy that had flickered between master and slave. The night promised nothing, yet in the quiet, Nathaniel and Liliana both knew that something had begun, a bond that would shape the days to come, fraught with passion, guilt, and the impossible desire to love in a world that would never permit it. And somewhere in the heart of the house, Margaret Whitmore turned a page in her book, unaware of the storm that raged beyond her carefully arranged life, unaware that the threads of desire, power, and tragedy had already begun to weave a story that would leave no one untouched. The plantation awoke slowly the next morning, bathed in a pale gold that softened the harsh edges of work and labor. Mist clung to the fields, curling between cotton stalks like ghostly fingers reaching toward the sky. The day promised heat, and with it, the relentless rhythm of toil that governed every life on the estate. Yet even amid the ordinary, the extraordinary simmered quietly, unnoticed by all but the few who sensed the currents of feeling swirling beneath the surface. Nathaniel Whitmore rose with the first light, the weight of yesterday's gaze lingering behind his eyes. His wife, Margaret, still slept in her cool, orderly chamber, the soft rustle of her silk sheets a reminder of her presence, her authority, and the safety of societal expectation. He dressed carefully, smoothing the creases of his coat and fastening each button with deliberate precision, as if the act itself could impose order on the chaos within. By the time he stepped onto the veranda, the morning had already begun its laborious symphony. Liliana moved among the workers, her hands deftly gathering cotton and guiding the younger women. Even in work, she carried a command that was unspoken but undeniable. Nathaniel watched, his eyes tracing the curve of her neck, the fluidity of her movements, the quiet confidence she carried like a secret weapon. Every glance, every brush of sunlight across her skin, tugged at a part of him he had long tried to suppress. He did not approach her, he knew better than to allow propriety to fracture completely. Instead, he lingered in shadow, allowing his observation to be both punishment and indulgence. Margaret would later note his prolonged absences from breakfast or household duties, but she would not question the reasons. Her attention was absorbed by the matters of social engagements, linens, and the careful maintenance of the Whitmore image. Liliana sensed him, as she always did. The knowledge of his gaze was a burden and a thrill, a subtle charge that traveled along her spine. She felt it in the small moments, when he watched her bend to pick cotton, when he adjusted his coat as though smoothing the very air between them, when his shadow fell across her work. Each time, a quiet war raged within her, a conflict between survival and the forbidden desire she was beginning to acknowledge, against a backdrop of laws and punishments that could destroy them both. The day progressed slowly, the heat pressing down like an accusation. The workers labored in long rows under the unyielding sun, the sound of rakes, shovels, and the rustling of cotton punctuating the oppressive quiet. Nathaniel's duties called him to the fields, ostensibly to inspect labor, to oversee the plantation's operations. But more often than not, his feet carried him closer to Liliana than necessity required, drawn by forces he could neither explain nor resist. He approached her at last under the guise of inspection. "The northern rows appear uneven," he said, his voice even, though his eyes betrayed the attention he paid to every curve, every movement, every quiet glance she cast his way. Liliana straightened, her hands pausing mid-motion, though her face remained impassive. "I will see to it, sir," she said softly, yet the faint tremor in her voice did not go unnoticed. "Very good," Nathaniel replied, and for a heartbeat, they stood in silence, the world reduced to the space between them. The heat, the dust, the endless labor all faded into insignificance. In that moment, he imagined touching her hand, offering words that could shatter propriety entirely, but the thought passed, forbidden and tantalizing. Margaret, meanwhile, wandered the main hall, cataloguing linens and considering letters from distant relatives. She noticed a subtle shift in Nathaniel's manner and absence, a fleeting tension in his movements, but she dismissed it as fatigue, the natural wear of a man burdened by responsibility. Yet intuition, honed over years of social maneuvering, whispered to her that something was amiss. She did not know the depth of the intrigue unfolding before her, nor the power of the quiet bond forming between master and slave. By midday, Nathaniel had returned to the house under the pretext of business, his mind ablaze with thoughts he could neither confess nor dismiss. He walked through the great hall, past portraits of stern ancestors and the imposing clock that marked each hour with cold precision, and found himself at the library, seeking refuge in the scent of old books and the silence they offered. Liliana, her tasks briefly complete, approached to deliver a message regarding the field hands. Her presence, once again, ignited a tension that crackled between them, silent yet palpable. Nathaniel looked up, and their eyes met, hers steady, measured, and unreadable, his betraying the tumult he felt. "Sir," she asked, her voice controlled, almost questioning, yet threaded with a softness that only he noticed. "Yes," he said, his tone clipped, though his mind wandered to places it ought not. "Everything is proceeding as expected." "Everything, sir." She curtsied slightly and turned to leave, the sway of her skirts a quiet defiance, a signal that she, too, understood the dangerous game they played. Later that evening, The plantation fell into the familiar rhythm of shadows and whispers. The sun had retreated behind the trees, leaving the estate bathed in the soft glow of twilight. The workers returned to their cabins, the dogs lay in the yard, and Nathaniel remained on the veranda, lost in thought. Margaret emerged in her finery, prepared for a small gathering of local gentry, unaware that her carefully curated life was beginning to fray at the edges. She smiled politely at Nathaniel, her expression warm yet distant. "The evening is pleasant," she remarked, as though commenting on the weather could mask the subtle fractures she did not yet perceive. "It is," he replied, though his attention lingered elsewhere, drawn irresistibly toward the shadows where Liliana had vanished for the night. As the hours passed, Nathaniel found himself wandering the estate grounds, tracing paths he should not have taken, seeking glimpses of the woman who had begun to occupy his thoughts entirely. In the dim light, he imagined conversations that could never occur, touches that were impossible yet devastatingly tempting, and a world where morality and law did not demand sacrifice of the heart. Liliana, in her quarters, sat quietly, the flickering light of a single candle casting long shadows across the walls. She thought of Nathaniel, of the way his eyes lingered, of the unspoken words that hovered in the air. She knew desire was dangerous, that acknowledgement could lead to ruin, but she also knew that restraint came at a cost, the quiet erosion of the self, the suppression of longing that demanded recognition. And so, as night deepened and the estate slept under the watchful gaze of the magnolias, the two of them existed in parallel worlds, close, intimate, yet separated by law, custom, and conscience. The tension between them was like a living thing, coiling and writhing, feeding on glances, gestures, and moments of shared silence. Each day brought new challenges, new temptations, and a growing awareness that the bond forming between master and slave could not be ignored indefinitely. The plantation, steeped in history, wealth, and oppression, had become a theater for forbidden emotion. Nathaniel and Liliana moved within it like dancers on a tightrope, balancing desire and danger, longing and restraint. Each passing hour deepened the connection, each fleeting look and touch a spark threatening to ignite a fire they could not contain. And amid the vast fields, the sprawling house, and the oppressive rules of the world around them, one truth became clear. What had begun as a quiet fascination was growing into something far more powerful, far more dangerous, and far more consuming than either of them could have anticipated. The night whispered promises they could not utter aloud, a reminder that hearts often defy reason, that desire is rarely constrained by law, and that in the shadows of the American South, love and tragedy are seldom far apart. The summer sky over Whitmore Estate had grown heavy and grey by mid-afternoon, as if the heavens themselves had conspired to reflect the unrest beneath the surface of the plantation. The heat of the day pressed down relentlessly, and the air became thick, damp, and almost suffocating. Even the cotton plants, their white blossoms dusted with sweat and soil, seemed to droop in anticipation of the coming storm. Nathaniel Whitmore stood beneath the veranda, surveying the fields with an uneasy eye. He sensed the shift in the air, not just the approaching weather, but the intangible tension that clung to every motion, every glance. Liliana worked near the northern rows, her movements precise, deliberate, and infuriatingly graceful. Every tilt of her head, every careful sweep of her hand over the cotton, seemed to taunt him, drawing him into the pull he had been fighting for weeks. Margaret, seated in the drawing room with a fine cloth stretched across her lap, glanced occasionally toward the veranda, noting the restless set of her husband's shoulders. Her intuition had long sensed that something stirred beneath the polite exterior of her household, though she had yet to understand the depth or danger of it. She returned her focus to her embroidery, forcing herself to trust in the appearances she so carefully maintained. The first rumble of thunder rolled across the distant hills, low and threatening, a warning that the storm was imminent. The plantation workers began to quicken their pace, gathering their tools, calling out to one another over the rising wind. Liliana's dark eyes lifted toward the sky, her jaw tightening as she noted the approaching tempest. She had long learned to respect the sudden fury of southern storms. One misstep could leave the fields ruined and the work undone. Nathaniel found himself walking toward her, ostensibly to offer guidance, though the truth was far more dangerous. The closer he came, the more acutely he felt the pull between them, a tension that had become unbearable in its intensity. He wanted to speak, to warn her of the storm in a way that allowed him to linger by her side, to feel the heat of her presence without admitting it aloud. "Liliana," he called, his voice carrying over the wind. She looked up, her expression composed but wary, as if she had anticipated his approach. "Yes, sir," she replied, her tone steady, almost detached, though the subtle quiver beneath it betrayed the awareness of what lay unspoken. "The northern rose, they need securing before the rain breaks. Will you see to it?" He spoke with authority, but the words were a thin veil over the undercurrent of longing that ran through every syllable. "I will," she said, inclining her head, but did not move immediately. Her gaze lingered on him, searching for something he could not give, yet craving recognition nonetheless. The storm rolled closer, and in that charged moment, the world seemed to shrink, leaving only them, the fields, and the invisible boundary between desire and propriety. The sky darkened suddenly, and the first sheets of rain began to fall, heavy and relentless. The wind whipped through the trees, and the cotton plants bent beneath its force. Nathaniel's instincts told him to seek shelter, but he lingered, compelled to remain near her despite the danger. "Sir, you should," Liliana began, but the words were lost to the roar of thunder. In a swift motion, she turned and ran toward the small shed at the edge of the northern field, the basket of cotton clutched against her chest. Nathaniel followed, unthinking, heart pounding, until he reached the shelter just as she pushed the door open. Inside, the air was cramped, filled with the scent of damp earth and cotton. They stood close, and for the first time, the physical proximity between them became unavoidable. Their shoulders brushed, the heat of the storm outside seemed to merge with the heat simmering between them. Liliana's dark eyes met his, wide and cautious, yet there was a tremor in her lips, a vulnerability she rarely allowed to show. "The storm came faster than I thought," Nathaniel said, his voice low, betraying a tension he could not entirely control. "Yes, sir," she replied softly, her gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before returning. "It is dangerous to be caught in this open." They stood in silence, the storm outside a mirror of the storm that had been building between them for weeks. Nathaniel wanted to speak, to confess the forbidden truth that had haunted him, but the weight of his position, of society's law, of his own conscience, held him back. Liliana, for her part, remained poised, yet every small movement, every shift of her weight, every glance, every hesitant breath spoke of longing restrained by fear. Lightning flashed, illuminating the small shed in a stark, white brilliance, and for a moment, Nathaniel saw the contours of her face with startling clarity. Her skin glowed in the brief light, her eyes deep pools of thought and feeling. He felt an ache in his chest, a longing that had no name, no safe outlet. The thunder followed swiftly, echoing their shared heartbeat, and he realized that they were suspended in a fragile, dangerous intimacy, poised on the edge of a line that could never be crossed openly. The storm forced them closer together as the wind rattled the door and rain splashed against the small windows. Nathaniel moved instinctively, offering his hand to steady a basket that threatened to tip, and their fingers brushed. The contact was electric, fleeting, but enough to ignite a fire that both feared and welcomed. Liliana withdrew slightly, but did not step away entirely, as though the risk itself was a tether, binding them to a shared, unspoken truth. Minutes passed, yet each one seemed to stretch into eternity. Nathaniel found himself studying her in a way he had never allowed before, her strength, her resilience, her careful self-possession, and the subtle vulnerability that surfaced only when the world pressed against her. He wanted to speak, to tell her everything, yet he knew that words could destroy what fragile equilibrium remained. Finally, the storm began to subside, the rain tapering to a soft drizzle, the wind losing its fury. Nathaniel stepped back reluctantly, aware of the dangerous closeness that had just been breached. Liliana adjusted her skirts, composed herself, and offered a small, polite nod. "The storm will pass soon," she said, her voice steady but softer than usual. "Yes," he replied, his own voice betraying a quiet tension. "And the fields will recover." As they emerged from the shed, the world seemed to have shifted slightly. The storm had passed, leaving the air cleansed, the earth fresh, and an invisible mark upon both of them. Nathaniel felt the weight of his desire pressing against the boundaries of propriety, while Liliana carried the memory of the brush of his fingers, the sound of his voice close enough to stir forbidden thought. Margaret, in the drawing room, had watched the storm from the window, noting the darkening clouds and the sudden rush of wind. She could not see them in the shed, but she felt an unnameable tension in the air, a whisper of something amiss. It was a shadow she could not define, a premonition that the equilibrium of her household was beginning to fracture. That night, as the plantation settled into uneasy calm, Nathaniel found himself restless, unable to ignore the vivid memory of Liliana's presence, of the proximity forced by the storm. He realized, with a mix of dread and desire, that nothing would be the same again. The storm had done more than soak the fields, it had stirred the hidden currents between master and slave, and the ripple it had created would be impossible to contain. For Liliana, too, the memory lingered. She lay awake in the small cabin, the sounds of rain still echoing in her ears, her mind replaying the fleeting touch, the heat of his presence, the weight of desire that had been exchanged without words. She knew it was dangerous, and yet she could not suppress the thrill that had awakened within her, a dangerous, exhilarating truth that neither of them could deny. And so, under the magnolia trees and the lingering traces of the storm, a subtle, forbidden bond had formed, a thread of connection that was as intoxicating as it was perilous, stretching across the boundaries of law, morality, and social convention. Each glance, each brush of hands, each unspoken thought added to the growing tension, drawing them deeper into a world of desire, guilt, and tragic possibility. The night whispered promises neither dared to speak aloud, and in the silence, both Nathaniel and Liliana understood the dangerous truth, that what had begun as admiration was evolving into something far more consuming, and that the path forward would demand courage, cunning, and the willingness to confront the consequences of hearts that refused to obey the rules. The days after the storm brought a heavy, suffocating heat that clung to the Whitmore estate like a stubborn secret. The sun bore down mercilessly on the fields, baking the earth and whitening the cotton to a harsh brilliance that made every drop of sweat a visible testament to labor. Yet amid the routine of work, the undercurrents between master and slave grew ever more pronounced, and every glance, every touch, carried an electric charge neither could ignore. Nathaniel Whitmore moved through the plantation with an intensity that bordered on obsession. His duties were many: inspecting crops, managing accounts, overseeing the work of dozens of hands, but his attention continually strayed. He found himself scanning the rows of cotton not for weeds or gaps, but for Liliana, for the curve of her neck, the tilt of her head, the subtle grace of her movements. She worked beside the others, obedient yet extraordinary, and he felt that magnetic pull he had tried to deny since the earliest days of spring. Inside the house, Margaret Whitmore noticed changes as well. Her husband's absent-minded moments during conversation, the restless tapping of his fingers upon the table, the way his eyes seemed to follow shadows, these small signs pricked at her awareness. She was a woman trained in observation and calculation, and she could not ignore the quiet shift in energy around the house. Though she lacked proof, her instincts whispered that something delicate and dangerous was taking shape, something that threatened the careful structure she had built around her life. Liliana herself felt the pull as acutely as Nathaniel did. In the privacy of her small cabin, she reflected on the stolen moments of the storm, the brush of his fingers, the weight of his gaze lingering longer than propriety should allow. She knew the consequences of misstep, the punishment that awaited a slave who allowed sentiment to interfere with obedience. Yet she also recognized the intensity of the connection, the subtle acknowledgement that her presence affected him as much as his presence affected her. It was in the late afternoon that the moment came that neither of them could avoid. Nathaniel had requested Liliana's assistance in reviewing the condition of the northern fields, citing concerns about soil quality after the storm. The pretext was entirely professional, yet the proximity it afforded was dangerous, irresistible. She approached the veranda, her basket empty, her steps measured but reluctant. Nathaniel met her gaze with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice low and smooth, though controlled. "The northern rose, there are areas I want to inspect more closely." Liliana inclined her head, and together they walked across the sun-baked earth, the rows of cotton forming narrow corridors that left little room between them. Every step carried a tension that neither could fully mask. Their conversation was professional, restrained, yet the air between their words was thick with unspoken emotion. At a point where the field narrowed and a small cluster of trees provided shade, Nathaniel paused. "These trees, they've grown faster than I expected," he remarked, ostensibly about the land. Yet as he spoke, his eyes did not stray from her face, tracing the contours of her features in a way that was impossible to justify under the guise of inspection. Liliana's hands twisted at the hem of her skirt, and for a moment, neither spoke. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows across their faces, and the world seemed to contract until it consisted only of them, two souls caught in a fragile, forbidden orbit. "Nathaniel," she began softly, her voice careful, measured, yet the tremor was undeniable. "We should return before the others notice we've lingered." "Yes," he replied, though neither moved immediately. His hand hovered near hers, an inch of separation that felt like a chasm. Every instinct told him to reach out, to close that distance, but the weight of law, morality, and consequence held him back. The first hint of fear flickered across her eyes, a reminder that the world outside this moment would not forgive indulgence. And yet, in that brief suspension, something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of longing, a shared understanding of the dangerous desire that had grown like a hidden flame. The day continued, yet the shadow of that moment lingered. Nathaniel returned to the house with a restless mind, pacing the hallways as if seeking relief from thoughts he could neither suppress nor satisfy. Margaret observed him quietly, noting the tautness in his movements, the distracted tilt of his head, and the occasional, almost imperceptible sigh. She could sense the shift, though she lacked the clarity to identify it, and it unnerved her in ways she could not name. Liliana, meanwhile, completed her work in silence, her thoughts echoing the same tension. She carried herself with composure, yet inside, her mind replayed the stolen proximity, the intensity of his gaze, the dangerous thrill of shared awareness. Each heartbeat was a reminder of what could never be, each breath a whisper of forbidden connection. That evening, Nathaniel found himself unable to focus on the business of the house. He wandered the veranda, tracing the contours of the estate as if seeking some anchor in the familiar landscape. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in bruised purples and golds, and the scent of magnolia blossoms hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faint, lingering smell of rain. Margaret prepared for a social visit from a neighboring family, the Whitmore estate's reputation dependent on her diligence and discretion. She dressed carefully, adjusting the folds of her gown, and carried herself with the poise that had been honed through years of practice. Yet she could not shake the sense of tension in the household, a quiet discord that made her uneasy. In the fields, Nathaniel's gaze lingered on the distant figures of workers leaving for their cabins. And somewhere in that distance, Liliana moved with her customary grace, carrying a quiet strength that captivated and tormented him in equal measure. He knew, with a painful clarity, that every moment of proximity, every stolen glance, was a temptation both dangerous and irresistible. The night descended, heavy and warm, and Nathaniel found himself standing on the veranda once more. The estate lay in stillness, yet the air seemed alive with unspoken truths and forbidden desires. Liliana had retired to her quarters, and Margaret had withdrawn into her parlor, leaving Nathaniel alone with the echoes of longing and conscience. He realized then, with a mixture of dread and exhilaration, that the bond forming between him and Liliana could not be denied. It was no longer merely admiration or fascination, it was something deeper, something that demanded acknowledgement even in the face of inevitable consequences. And yet, as he looked out across the fields, toward the small cabin where Liliana rested, he knew that desire and morality were locked in a battle with no clear victor. The line between love and transgression had become blurred, and every glance, every word, every fleeting moment of proximity drew them both further into a web from which there was no easy escape. The plantation, vast and oppressive, bore witness to a quiet revolution of the heart, a storm more perilous than any the summer skies could muster, fueled by longing, fear, and the impossible hope that hearts could find one another in a world built on division, law, and cruelty. In the darkness, under the watchful magnolia trees, Nathaniel and Liliana existed in suspended tension, hearts beating in dangerous harmony, aware that every choice, every gesture, could tip the balance between desire and ruin. And in that delicate, perilous space, the seeds of love, tragedy, and moral reckoning were being sown, destined to bloom with both beauty and sorrow. The plantation awoke to a morning tinged with unease. Even the cotton seemed reluctant to glisten beneath the sun, its blossoms weighed down as though anticipating the turmoil that would soon ripple through the estate. Nathaniel Whitmore, already restless, paced the veranda with his coat unbuttoned, his cravat loosened, as if attempting to shed the mounting tension alongside the suffocating heat. Yesterday's proximity in the northern fields, the storm, and the brief shelter in the shed had left marks invisible to the world but deeply felt in their hearts. Nathaniel's mind replayed every moment, every brush of hands, every shared glance. Liliana's poise, her subtle defiance, haunted him with relentless insistence. Desire had grown into a quiet obsession, one that gnawed at the edges of his conscience and morality, forcing him to confront truths he had long avoided. Liliana, for her part, felt the weight of the bond equally, though she carried it with quiet discipline. She worked alongside the other women in the fields, her hands steady, her eyes distant. Every glance toward the house, every step near the veranda, reminded her of the storm, the shed, and the forbidden intensity between her and Nathaniel. She understood the danger that lurked in each shared moment, yet the connection had become a lifeline, as invisible as it was indispensable. Margaret Whitmore, sharp and increasingly uneasy, began to notice changes she could neither name nor ignore. Nathaniel lingered too long in the fields at odd hours, his glances toward Liliana lingered with a subtle intensity she had never observed before. There was a tension in his walk, in his tone, in the quiet sighs he released when he thought no one watched. Margaret's instincts, refined over years of navigating social hierarchies, warned her that something impermissible was unfolding beneath her carefully managed household. It was late afternoon when the inevitable confrontation began. Nathaniel had summoned Liliana to the house, ostensibly to discuss a minor issue with the field operations. She arrived promptly, carrying the small ledger of tasks, her movements measured, her expression unreadable. "Sir," she said, inclining her head respectfully, her voice soft yet steady. "Liliana," Nathaniel replied, his tone calm, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the turmoil he felt. "I need to review the northern fields. There are concerns after the storm that require immediate attention." "Yes, sir," she answered, though her fingers trembled slightly as she held the ledger. She sensed the heightened energy in the air, the invisible line of desire drawn taut between them. They walked toward the veranda, where the sun cast long shadows across the polished wood. Every step was weighted with anticipation, every breath filled with unspoken longing. For a brief moment, the world outside ceased to exist, there was only the two of them, and the dangerous intimacy that hovered in every gesture, every glance. Margaret emerged from the parlor, her presence sudden and deliberate. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice measured, with a subtle edge that hinted at suspicion. "Is there a reason Liliana is walking with you? Surely the fields can wait." Nathaniel stiffened imperceptibly, caught between truth and social expectation. "Margaret, the northern rows require immediate attention," he replied, his voice even, though it carried an undertone of irritation. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, the first visible crack in her composed exterior. "And yet," she said, her gaze flicking toward Liliana with quiet scrutiny, "you do not attend to the other workers with the same diligence. I cannot help but notice this. Attention seems reserved for her alone." The air thickened, the tension palpable. Liliana lowered her gaze, hands tightening around the ledger, as Nathaniel felt the sharp sting of confrontation. The truth of his feelings was no longer a private struggle, it was a visible fracture in the household, a crack that could widen at any moment. "I am ensuring the fields are secure," Nathaniel said, his voice firm but measured, striving to maintain control. "Liliana's knowledge of the terrain is unmatched." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes revealing a storm of suspicion, jealousy, and sharp intelligence. "Unmatched, perhaps," she said softly, "but I will be watching. Do not mistake my leniency for ignorance." She left the veranda without another word, leaving a charged silence behind her. Nathaniel turned to Liliana, whose face was pale, her composure trembling only slightly. "I apologize," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, "for this intrusion into your day." She shook her head, her lips barely parting. "It is not your fault, sir," she replied, each word weighed with care, each syllable imbued with the tension between desire and caution. For a long moment, neither spoke. The heat of the day seemed to press down upon them, the distant sounds of work fading into irrelevance. Nathaniel felt the familiar ache in his chest, the forbidden longing that had grown steadily since spring. Liliana felt it too, the pull of proximity, the silent acknowledgement of something neither could fully name, the dangerous thrill of recognition. Days passed, each one layering tension upon tension. Nathaniel found excuses to linger near Liliana, to observe her from the veranda, to ask her questions that were merely pretexts for conversation. Each interaction was fraught with restraint, every glance a reminder of the boundaries they were forbidden to cross. Meanwhile, Margaret's suspicions sharpened. She noticed the subtle glances, the lingering touches of fingers in work tasks, the quiet closeness that Nathaniel seemed to allow with alarming ease. Her mind raced with possibilities, and though she remained outwardly composed, a quiet determination began to form. She would uncover the truth of what threatened the fragile order of her household. The tension reached a crescendo one evening when a young field hand approached Nathaniel with news of damaged crops after the storm. Nathaniel excused himself from the veranda and walked toward the northern fields, Liliana following closely, ostensibly to guide him through the damaged rows. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the earth. Alone among the cotton, the world contracted until it consisted only of them. Nathaniel felt the familiar pull, the quiet, urgent need that had grown impossible to ignore. "Liliana," he began, his voice low and hesitant, "these fields. I cannot manage them without your guidance." Her eyes met his, wide and cautious, yet there was a spark in them that betrayed her awareness of the undercurrent between them. I will do my best, sir," she said softly, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and longing. They moved through the rows together, hands brushing unintentionally, shoulders nearly touching, each step a reminder of the invisible line they could not cross. And yet, the desire simmered, a quiet, dangerous flame that neither could extinguish. When the work was done, Nathaniel turned to her, his heart pounding, the weight of moral consequence heavy upon him. I should not," he began, then faltered, the words caught in his throat. "Sir," she interrupted gently, "we must return before Margaret notices our absence." The reminder of reality struck them both. Desire, however consuming, could not erase duty, law, or social expectation. Nathaniel nodded, swallowing the ache that lingered in his chest. They returned in silence, each carrying the memory of proximity, the thrill of forbidden closeness, and the heavy knowledge that every choice henceforth was fraught with consequence. That night, Nathaniel stood on the veranda, gazing toward the small cabin where Liliana slept. The air was thick with magnolia and lingering humidity, a quiet reminder of the plantation's unyielding presence. He knew that the connection forming between them could no longer be contained within polite observation or fleeting gestures. The storm had passed, but the tempest within him raged stronger than ever. Liliana, in her modest quarters, traced the lines of the day in her mind, recalling each touch, each glance, each heartbeat that had spoken volumes without words. She knew the dangers, the moral impossibility, yet she could not deny the depth of feeling that had been awakened. It was a silent acknowledgement of desire, guilt, and something that neither of them could fully name, but both understood in the quiet recesses of their hearts. The plantation, with its sprawling fields and imposing house, had become a theater for a forbidden, fragile intimacy, a bond that promised both ecstasy and ruin. Each glance, each touch, each unspoken word was a step closer to consequences they could neither avoid nor fully predict. And so, under the magnolias and the fading light of evening, two hearts beat in parallel, suspended in tension, desire, and inevitable reckoning. The path forward would demand choices, sacrifices, and courage, choices that would shape the fates of all three, master, slave, and wife, forever. The oppressive summer heat gave way to a simmering tension that seemed to cling to every corner of Whitmore Estate. The cotton fields swayed under a breeze that carried the scent of rain and something more intangible, a sense of foreboding, a quiet warning of storms both literal and metaphorical. Nathaniel Whitmore felt it in the pit of his stomach, a restless anxiety that shadowed his every step. The lingering memory of Liliana's touch, of the quiet intensity of her gaze, had become an ache he could neither ignore nor conceal. The plantation, though serene in appearance, bore the weight of expectation, law, and legacy. Nathaniel's estate demanded attention, discipline, and vigilance. Each worker relied on the structure he maintained. Yet, the personal turmoil that now occupied his thoughts made each decision heavier, each command fraught with distraction. Even as he moved through the rows of cotton, inspecting the growth and quality, his eyes inevitably sought Liliana, searching for her familiar figure among the laborious. She moved through the field with quiet diligence, her hands deftly guiding young women and instructing them on the proper harvesting technique. Every step, every tilt of her head, seemed imbued with a natural authority, one that made Nathaniel's pulse quicken and his mind reel with conflicting emotions. The intensity of their connection, forged in fleeting moments of proximity and silent acknowledgement, had grown beyond simple fascination into something far more consuming. Yet the world around them remained unyielding. Margaret Whitmore had begun to act on her suspicions, subtle though they were. She observed Nathaniel with a keen eye, noting the frequent glances toward Liliana, the brief hesitations in his tone, the restless pacing when he believed no one watched. Though she could not pinpoint the cause, instinct told her that something perilous had begun. Her demeanor shifted imperceptibly, she became more attentive, more vigilant, and yet outwardly, she maintained the facade of composure and charm expected of a plantation mistress. It was in the late afternoon that the first sign of true danger arrived. A group of field hands came rushing to Nathaniel, their faces pale with urgency. "Sir, there's trouble at the eastern fields," one called, breathless from running. The irrigation channels collapsed, flooding the young crop. Nathaniel's heart skipped a beat, but his training and authority propelled him forward. "Gather a team and bring buckets. Everyone to the eastern fields immediately," he commanded, voice sharp, controlled. He turned to Liliana. "Come with me. Your knowledge of the channels is essential." She nodded, understanding both the urgency and the unspoken tension that hovered between them. They moved swiftly through the plantation, the sound of rushing water growing louder as they approached the damaged irrigation system. The young crops were at risk, and failure to act quickly could ruin weeks of work and devastate the plantation's yield. Amid the chaos, Nathaniel and Liliana worked side by side, their proximity unavoidable. Water splashed around their boots, mud clinging to their clothing, yet neither flinched. The heat of labor, the urgency of the crisis, and the closeness of their bodies created a tension that bordered on unbearable. Hands brushed accidentally, shoulders collided in the narrow space, and every glance carried a weight of meaning neither could afford to acknowledge openly. "Careful!" Nathaniel shouted over the roar of water, grasping the edge of a wooden plank as it threatened to tip. Liliana's hand shot out instinctively, brushing his fingers as she steadied the plank. The contact was electric, fleeting, yet it left a mark that neither could ignore. Minutes stretched into hours as they battled the flood, their combined skill and determination slowly regaining control over the channels. Sweat, mud, and exhaustion coated them both, yet they continued without pause. Only when the water was finally redirected, and the crops saved from ruin, did they step back, panting, hands trembling from exertion and something more. Nathaniel's chest heaved as he wiped the sweat from his brow. "We did it," he said, voice low, almost incredulous. His eyes lingered on Liliana, tracing the lines of her face, the damp strands of hair clinging to her neck. "Without you." She looked down, brushing mud from her hands, and for a moment, the world seemed suspended. "It was a team effort, sir," she replied softly, though the faint tremor in her voice betrayed her awareness of the electricity between them. The moment was broken abruptly by the sharp voice of Margaret, who had arrived unnoticed at the edge of the fields. "Nathaniel." "Liliana," she called, her tone measured but laced with controlled fury. "What is going on here? I will not have you endangering yourselves or the estate through negligence or distraction." Nathaniel straightened immediately, shame and tension battling within him. "Margaret, we were merely addressing a structural failure in the irrigation channels. Everything is under control now." Margaret's gaze shifted to Liliana, sharp and calculating. "And yet," she said slowly, "you seem to spend more time near him than is necessary for simple oversight." There was no accusation in her words, only a quiet, formidable power that carried far more threat than any overt confrontation could. Liliana's hands clenched at her sides, heart pounding. She met Margaret's eyes briefly, nodding with careful composure. "I was assisting," she said, voice firm yet respectful. Margaret's eyes flicked to Nathaniel once more, then to the irrigation channel, and finally back to Liliana. She said nothing more, but the silent judgment, the unspoken warning, was clear. Nathaniel knew then that Margaret's suspicions were no longer vague. She had seen enough to recognize the dangerous closeness, and she would act if given reason. As they returned to the house, the air between Nathaniel and Liliana was heavy with unspoken words. Every glance, every step, carried the weight of their shared secret, the danger of discovery, and the forbidden thrill that had been growing steadily over the past months. The plantation, with its sprawling fields, imposing house, and magnolia-lined paths, had become a crucible of desire, morality, and consequence. That night, Nathaniel stood on the veranda alone, staring toward Liliana's quarters. The memory of the day, the brush of hands, the shared labor, the intensity of proximity burned in his mind. He knew that the bond forming between them could no longer be contained within stolen glances or professional necessity. Desire had grown into something undeniable, and with Margaret's suspicion now sharpened, the stakes were higher than ever. Meanwhile, Liliana lay awake in her small cabin, the sounds of the night punctuated by the distant hum of insects and the faint creak of the house settling. She traced the events of the day in her mind, the danger of the irrigation collapse, the thrill of closeness, and the unspoken truths between her and Nathaniel. Each heartbeat reminded her of the peril inherent in their connection, each breath carried the weight of forbidden desire. And so, under the magnolias and the moonlit sky, two hearts beat in secret harmony, suspended between longing and consequence, desire and morality. The plantation had witnessed countless seasons, storms, and struggles, yet never had it borne witness to a fire as consuming or as perilous as the one now smoldering in the shadows of its vast fields and stately house. The next days promised more labor, more scrutiny, and the inevitable collision of hearts, wills, and societal expectation. Nathaniel and Liliana would soon confront not only the impossible tension between them, but the devastating moral and emotional consequences that their bond would demand. The oppressive heat of the late summer days bore down on Whitmore Estate, making every movement heavy and every breath laborious. The cotton fields shimmered under the relentless sun, rows of white blossoms bending under the weight of humidity. Yet amid the mundane rhythm of labor, an invisible storm raged between Nathaniel Whitmore and Liliana, a storm no thunder or rain could compare to, one of desire, restraint, and perilous longing. Nathaniel felt it in every glance he cast toward her, every word spoken in seemingly ordinary conversation. He would ask her about field operations, irrigation schedules, or labor logistics, but his mind could not help tracing the line of her jaw, the curve of her neck, the fluid motion of her hands. Each brush of fingers over a ledger, each incidental touch, sent a tremor through him, one that he fought to suppress in the face of morality, law, and the ever-watchful eyes of his wife. Liliana, too, felt the storm. Her body moved automatically through the work that had become routine over the years, but her mind was alive with stolen moments, remembered touches, and the forbidden intensity of Nathaniel's gaze. She knew that even a slip, one misstep, one moment of indulgence, could bring ruin. Yet each glance, each shared breath, made it harder to suppress the growing, undeniable bond. It was late afternoon when Nathaniel summoned her to the house, ostensibly to review the planting schedules for the coming season. She entered the study quietly, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of caution and unspoken understanding. The room smelled faintly of leather and paper, a comforting yet confining scent that seemed to heighten the tension between them. Liliana, Nathaniel began, closing the ledger before him, I need your insight on the northern plots. The soil quality has shifted since the storm, and he paused, struggling to maintain the facade of professional concern. I cannot manage this without you. Her hands hovered at her sides, and for a moment, the distance between them seemed charged with electric anticipation. I will do my best, sir, she replied softly, her voice steady but her eyes betraying the flutter of emotion beneath. A silence fell over the room, stretching impossibly long. Nathaniel's heart pounded, every instinct urging him to bridge the gap, to close the distance that had been maintained with such careful discipline. Liliana's eyes met his, dark and unwavering, yet glimmering with the same dangerous acknowledgement he felt. For a heartbeat, it seemed the world had shrunk to just the two of them, the faint hum of the distant fields, the weight of the late summer sun filtering through the windows, the slow, deliberate rhythm of their breathing. Nathaniel's hand hovered, trembled, but did not reach. Liliana's fingers twitched ever so slightly, a subtle gesture of restraint and temptation intertwined. And then, the quiet was broken by a sound neither had anticipated, Margaret's voice, sharp and precise, cutting through the fragile tension like a whip. Nathaniel, Liliana, she called from the hall outside, you will not keep me waiting. Dinner is served, and I expect both of you to appear promptly. The spell of the moment shattered instantly. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, forcing himself to regain composure, while Liliana lowered her gaze, bowing slightly in acknowledgement. Words went unspoken, but the weight of what might have occurred lingered, a silent acknowledgement of desire restrained and temptation narrowly avoided. Dinner that evening was a careful dance of appearances. Margaret presided over the table with her customary grace, her eyes occasionally flicking toward Nathaniel and Liliana with a subtle intensity that spoke volumes. She asked questions about the fields, about labor schedules, about the crops, all while maintaining a poised, civilized exterior. Yet the undercurrent of suspicion was palpable, a quiet pressure that Nathaniel and Liliana both felt acutely. Nathaniel's eyes sought Liliana's once or twice across the table, catching fleeting glances that spoke of longing, acknowledgement, and the impossibility of their situation. Liliana met his gaze briefly, her expression composed, yet her chest tightened with the remembered heat of earlier moments, the brush of hands, the shared labor, the unspoken, fragile connection that neither dared to voice. After dinner, Margaret retired early, citing fatigue. Nathaniel lingered in the study, ostensibly to finalize accounts, but his thoughts were far from business. Liliana remained behind, ostensibly tidying papers and ensuring the room was in order. The air between them was thick, each small movement heavy with unspoken meaning, every breath a reminder of the forbidden tension that had grown steadily over the months. Sir, Liliana said softly, her voice almost a whisper, is there anything else you require of me? Nathaniel turned to her slowly, his gaze intense, and for a brief moment, the world contracted around them. No, he said finally, though every word carried the weight of desire restrained and conscience tested. But, be cautious. Margaret's attention is sharper than you realize. Her eyes flickered with acknowledgement, and a quiet understanding passed between them, an unspoken pact of restraint, yet also of recognition of the dangerous intimacy that had been forged in silence, labor, and fleeting proximity. The night deepened, the plantation quiet except for the occasional rustle of the magnolia trees in the warm breeze. Nathaniel stood on the veranda, gazing toward the distant cabins, where Liliana rested. He felt the ache of longing, the tension of unspoken truths, and the heavy knowledge that each day brought them closer to a point from which there would be no return. Liliana, in her quarters, lay awake under the thin blanket, tracing the contours of the day in her mind. She remembered every glance, every accidental touch, every heartbeat shared with Nathaniel. The danger was real, the consequences unavoidable, yet the connection, the forbidden, fragile bond, was undeniable. As the moon rose over Whitmore Estate, casting pale light across the fields, the threads of desire, morality, and consequence wove together tightly. The plantation had become a theater of longing and restraint, where hearts beat dangerously close, yet the boundaries of law, custom, and survival remained ever present. And in that silence, both Nathaniel and Liliana understood a truth as terrifying as it was exhilarating, that the closer they grew in spirit and heart, the greater the risk, the deeper the temptation, and the more devastating the consequences would become. The late summer air hung heavy with a quiet menace, as if the land itself knew that the equilibrium of Whitmore Estate was fraying. Even the magnolia trees seemed to bow under the weight of unspoken truths. Nathaniel Whitmore felt it in every step, every glance, and every unsteady breath. The past weeks of stolen proximity, silent acknowledgments, and restrained longing had left him restless, haunted by desire and conscience in equal measure. Liliana, too, carried the burden of tension. Each day brought new challenges, supervising the fields, avoiding Margaret's scrutiny, and navigating the invisible, dangerous bond between herself and Nathaniel. The memory of their near-intimate moments, the storm in the northern fields, the brush of hands, the charged silences gnawed at her, impossible to ignore yet impossible to act upon. Margaret, ever perceptive, had begun to act with subtle precision. She observed Nathaniel more closely, questioned him under the guise of concern for the estate, and ensured that Liliana's movements were noted. Her vigilance was quiet but relentless, a steady pressure that neither Nathaniel nor Liliana could escape. It was a humid afternoon when the first real fracture occurred. Nathaniel had called Liliana to the veranda to review the newly repaired irrigation channels, his voice steady but edged with tension. "I need your assessment, Liliana. The channels must hold through the next rain, or the crops will be ruined." "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice calm yet tinged with the underlying tension that had become constant between them. They stepped out onto the veranda together, the air thick with heat and expectation. Margaret appeared then, emerging from the parlor with quiet determination. "Nathaniel, Liliana," she said, her tone formal but sharp, "I trust the irrigation is under control. Yet I cannot ignore the amount of time you spend together. I will not have propriety compromised under my roof." Nathaniel stiffened, the weight of her words settling like a physical blow. "Margaret, our concern is the welfare of the crops. Liliana's knowledge is invaluable. And your judgment, Nathaniel," Margaret interrupted, her eyes piercing. "Shall I remind you that the household must remain above reproach? Do not let desire cloud your duty." Her words cut through Nathaniel like a knife, yet beneath the sharp edge was an unspoken warning. She knew enough to watch, to wait, to act. Liliana's hands clenched at her sides, and she bowed her head, acutely aware that the fragile balance between them was slipping, that each heartbeat carried the risk of exposure and ruin. The tension lingered, thick and suffocating, until Margaret left, her presence a lingering shadow. Nathaniel and Liliana remained on the veranda, the weight of unspoken longing pressing against the barriers they had tried to maintain. "Nathaniel," Liliana said softly, her voice trembling despite her attempt at composure. "We cannot whatever this is, cannot continue if we are discovered. "I know," he whispered, his gaze fixed on her face, tracing the line of her jaw, the dark depth of her eyes. "And yet I cannot stop thinking of you, of us, of what we might be if the world allowed it." Their hands brushed accidentally as he reached for the ledger, and the contact sent a jolt through them both. The world seemed to collapse into that instant, the heat of the sun, the distant hum of the fields, the impossibility of their desire. They stood there, trembling on the edge of temptation, acutely aware that one misstep could bring devastation to both their lives. The next days were a delicate dance of appearances. Nathaniel tried to maintain order and control, but every glance at Liliana, every fleeting brush of fingers, deepened the silent pull between them. Margaret's vigilance intensified. She asked questions that seemed casual, yet carried the weight of accusation. Liliana moved through the fields with quiet grace, yet every heartbeat reminded her of the forbidden tension simmering just beneath the surface. Then came the incident that would irreversibly alter the course of their lives. A sudden, violent storm swept across the plantation, ripping through the cotton fields and flooding the repaired channels. The workers scrambled, shouting over the roar of wind and rain. Nathaniel and Liliana rushed to the northern plots, braving the downpour to save what crops they could. In the chaos, Nathaniel slipped on the muddy bank, falling toward the rushing water. Liliana lunged instinctively, catching his arm just as he lost his balance. They fell together into the shallow water, mud and rain soaking their clothes, hearts pounding with adrenaline and fear. For a moment, everything froze. The storm, the fields, the impossible proximity of their bodies. Nathaniel's chest pressed against hers, and in the roar of the rain, their eyes met, dark, urgent, and full of unspoken desire. Yet even in that moment, reality pressed against them. Margaret's sharp voice echoed in Nathaniel's mind, the consequences of discovery looming like a specter over every heartbeat. Finally, they separated, pulling themselves from the water, soaked and trembling. Nathaniel's hand lingered a moment longer than necessary, a silent acknowledgement of the connection they could not ignore. Liliana adjusted her skirt, bowing her head, her cheeks flushed with exertion and forbidden emotion. The storm passed as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving devastation in its wake and a lingering tension that neither Nathaniel nor Liliana could escape. They returned to the house, mud and water marking their clothing, hearts still racing from the proximity forced upon them by circumstance. That night, Nathaniel stood on the veranda, staring into the darkness where the fields had been ravaged. He knew that the bond between him and Liliana could no longer remain hidden, that every choice henceforth carried irreversible consequences. Liliana, in her quarters, lay awake, heart pounding with the memory of the storm, the brush of hands, and the dangerous, irresistible closeness. Whitmore Estate, with its sprawling fields and imposing house, had become a crucible of desire, morality, and consequence. Each stolen glance, each touch, each heartbeat shared in silence was a step closer to tragedy. And as the moonlight filtered through the magnolia trees, Nathaniel and Liliana understood a terrifying truth. The fire between them had grown too strong to be contained, and the consequences of desire were about to manifest in ways neither could fully prepare for. The early autumn air carried a chill that seemed unusual for the southern countryside. Whitmore Estate, long accustomed to the languid heat of summer, now felt rigid and uneasy, as if nature itself sensed the fragile, dangerous balance within the household. Nathaniel Whitmore paced the veranda, his hands clenched tightly behind his back, mind spinning with the events of the past weeks. Each glance toward Liliana, each unspoken word, each fleeting brush of fingers in the fields weighed heavily on him. The storm had passed, yet its memory, the brush of mud-soaked hands, the shared terror remained vivid, a constant, unrelenting reminder of the forbidden intimacy that had taken root. Liliana, too, felt the tension inescapably. She moved through her tasks with grace and discipline, yet every heartbeat reminded her of Nathaniel, every shadow stirred the memory of the moments they had narrowly contained. She had learned to mask her emotions, to hide her longing beneath obedience and diligence, but the restraint was becoming almost unbearable. Margaret Whitmore had grown more watchful than ever. Her suspicions, once subtle and simmering beneath the surface, had solidified into certainty. She observed Nathaniel with the precision of a hawk, noted Liliana's gestures, and connected the threads that hinted at a dangerous bond. Though she had not yet acted openly, the weight of her scrutiny hung over the household like a sword, ready to fall at any misstep. It was during a quiet afternoon, when the estate seemed suspended in uneasy stillness, that the culmination arrived. Nathaniel had summoned Liliana to the veranda to review the latest accounts of field work, a pretext that neither of them fully believed. As she approached, the air between them thickened, each step loaded with unspoken acknowledgement. "Sir," she began, voice steady yet soft, "is there something specific you wish to discuss?" Nathaniel hesitated, the ledger clutched in his hand a feeble shield against the intensity of his own emotions. "Liliana." He stopped, the words lodged in his throat, the impossible weight of truth pressing down. Before he could continue, Margaret appeared at the veranda, her presence commanding and sudden. "Nathaniel," she said, voice icy, "you summoned Liliana alone again. I will not have propriety compromised under my roof." Nathaniel straightened, guilt and tension twisting within him. "Margaret, this is merely about estate work. Liliana's insight is required." "Required?" Margaret's eyes blazed with sharp understanding. "Do not insult me. I know what is happening between you two. I have observed it long enough. You will cease this at once." The confrontation hung in the air like a storm about to break. Liliana's hands trembled, and she bowed her head, acutely aware that exposure had come. Nathaniel's pulse pounded in his ears, the unspoken bond between them now dangerously illuminated by Margaret's perception. "Margaret," Nathaniel began, voice low but firm, it is not simple." "You will not justify it," Margaret interrupted sharply. "I will not allow scandal, impropriety, or betrayal in my household. You must make a choice." The weight of her words pressed upon Nathaniel like a physical force. Desire, morality, law, and conscience collided violently within him. Liliana looked to him, her eyes dark pools of fear, longing, and resignation. She understood fully, whatever choice he made now would define the fates of all three of them. In the quiet that followed, Nathaniel made his decision, but not in the way either woman had expected. He turned to Liliana, his gaze fierce yet tender, and spoke softly, almost as if confessing to the world itself. "You must leave." Liliana's eyes widened in shock, disbelief flickering across her features. "Leave, sir?" "For your safety, for your life, for all of ours," Nathaniel interrupted, his voice breaking. "Margaret's suspicion, it will not be contained. You and we cannot continue. It is too dangerous. I cannot allow this to destroy you, nor my household, nor the fragile honor that remains." Tears pricked at the corners of Liliana's eyes, but she bowed her head, understanding the impossible truth. The desire, the bond, the quiet, electric intimacy, they could not survive the world in which they lived. Margaret watched silently, her expression unreadable, yet the relief was faintly visible in the tightening of her jaw. The confrontation had ended, but not without its own cost. The following days were a delicate unraveling of lives. Nathaniel arranged for Liliana to be transferred to another estate far from Whitmore's lands, a subtle act of protection disguised as duty. She packed her few belongings, her heart heavy with the ache of leaving not only the place she had known all her life but the man who had come to occupy the deepest, most forbidden parts of her heart. The night before her departure, Nathaniel met her at the edge of the property, where the magnolia trees framed the moonlit sky. The air was cool, scented faintly with rain and earth, heavy with the weight of unspoken farewells. "Liliana," he whispered, voice trembling, "I cannot say it. I cannot express what I feel. But know this, what we shared, it mattered. It will remain with me, always." She placed her hand briefly in his, the contact brief yet searing, and nodded. "And I," she replied softly, "will carry it with me, always. But we must survive." The next morning, Liliana departed, leaving behind the estate, the fields, and the life she had known. Nathaniel watched from the veranda as the carriage disappeared down the long magnolia-lined avenue, the sun rising behind it like a witness to both beauty and sorrow. Whitmore Estate continued its quiet rhythm, the cotton fields swaying under the wind, the house standing stately and imposing. Yet within its walls, within its shadows, a wound remained, a reminder of forbidden love, of moral impossibility, and of hearts that had dared to beat in defiance of a world built on law, propriety, and cruel divisions. Nathaniel Whitmore continued his life with the weight of memory pressing upon him, the ache of longing buried deep beneath duty. Margaret maintained her vigilance, her life intact but marked by the awareness of the fragile, dangerous emotions she had witnessed. And Liliana, far from the estate, carried with her the bittersweet knowledge of a bond that could never be, yet had been real in its intensity, its tenderness, and its tragedy. And so, the story of Nathaniel and Liliana ended not in union, but in survival, the preservation of life, the sacrifice of desire, and the haunting, enduring knowledge of what could have been. The plantation remained, the fields remained, the magnolia trees remained, and within their shadows lingered the echoes of a love both impossible and unforgettable.